Hello, welcome to OpenShift series. I am Milind. In this lecture, I will explain how to deploy applications on OpenShift cluster. If you want to understand how to set up OpenShift cluster, please watch my previous video on OpenShift basics and setup. Source to image, as the name implies, is responsible for transforming your application source code into an executable Docker image that you can run inside OpenShift cluster. Now let's see how it works. The total build process involves several steps. First, a build container gets deployed. It is responsible for performing build steps. It downloads application source code from Git repository, streams application source code to detect pom.xml in case of Java or requirements.txt in case of Python. Launch the build and execute bash scripts such as assemble or run. Save the final image inside the internal image registry. Then a deploy container gets launched. Deploy container will pull the recently saved application image and deploy the image. Now let's understand how to deploy application using templates. When you deploy an application, internally it creates few Kubernetes objects such as deployment, service, routes. A template describes a set of objects that can be parameterized and processed to produce a list of objects. A template can be processed to create anything you have permission to create within a project. For example, services, build configurations, and deployment configurations. You can create a list of objects from template using CLI or the global template library using Web Console. Let's understand this concept in the demo. In this demo, I will show you how to deploy Java application using OpenShift Web Console. In this demo, I will use from Git option. This option will pull the code from the Git repository, build the code, and deploy the application on OpenShift cluster. For this demo, I have a Git repository which has pet clinic application source code. We will use this source code to build and deploy application on OpenShift cluster. So let's see how we can deploy. So first, select from Git option. Here you need to specify the Git repository URL. So I'll clone the Git repository URL, copy it and paste it here. Now as you can see, there are options available to build the Java application. There are multiple options available. As we are deploying a Java application, we will use Java builder image. There is also an advanced Git option which we can leverage to use the pet clinic directory source code. As you can see, it has automatically picked up the Java 11 image. Now let's specify the application name. Here are the resources types which is asked to select. Either you can select deployment or deployment config. For this demo, we will consider deployment and we will start creating the application. As you can see in the topology tab, there are three different actions is going on. First is build. So build is running. We can go and check the build logs, which is exactly happening the way it is. It is pulling the source code from Git repository, which we have specified. Now it started creating a Docker image. Now it started building the application. We can expand and check the full log. As you can see, the build has successfully completed. Now it started pushing the Docker image into the repository. As you can see, the build application has been completed. Let's check the topology tab one more time. Now in this case, you can see the pod is in blue state, which means the pod has been spinned up and which is in the running state. We also can check the logs of the pod. As you can see, the Tomcat server has been started on 8080 port. We can check the details of the pod. As you can see, there are no requests, but we can check the status that is running. Now we'll go back to the topology tab and check the route. The application is successfully deployed and which is accessible from this URL. We also can check the status of this deployment using command line. So let's log in through the command line to this cluster. For this, you can go and copy the login command. This token is being generated and we can utilize to use it for login. Now we can paste the copied string. Now we can check OC, get pods. As you can see, there are two pods has been shown. First is a build pod, which is used to pull the code and build the application and deploy the application. And the second one is an application pod, which is running. As we have seen, the application deployment using Web Console. Now let's see how we can deploy application using command line. We will use OC commands to deploy the application. So let's use OC new app command. Now let's specify the application source code repository URL, that is https://devopsdean/openshift.git. Now, as we have our code inside a directory, we will specify that using context directory equal to pet clinic. Now let's specify the application name, that is pet clinic command line. Now we will specify the image stream which we have already built, that is image stream equal to pet clinic application. We also can specify the label which we will be using to identify the application deployment resources. We will specify the app equals to pet clinic cmd. Now let's run this command. As you can see, it has spin up bunch of few resources, which is including the image stream, the build config, the deployment config, and a service to access the application. Now let's see what are the pods has been launched. So we'll use oc get pods. As you can see, there is a build pod has been launched. We can check this log from the web console. As you can see, there is one more application has been launched, and we'll check the build logs. I will expand it. It will perform all those activities which has already been performed for a web console deployment. As you can see, the build has been completed. So let's check the topology tab. Here you can see the build has been completed. Now let's check the console, that pod is spin up or not. We'll give oc get pods. Yes, we can see this pod has been spin up. And there were two more pods in a completed state, which is a build pod and a deploy pod. In the build pod, we have done all the build process, and deploy pod which was used to deploy the application. Now let's see what are the resources has been created by this deployment. Let's use oc get all -l app equal to pet clinic cmd. As you can see, there are a bunch of resources has been created. That is, first is a deployment config, second is a build config, then the build pod, then the image stream and the pod, then the replica sets, then a service. Now we will check how we can access this application. For that, we can use the existing route which has already been created in the previous deployment. So we can utilize this route. So for that, we will check what is the service which has been created. So there are two services. First is application. The second one is application from command line. So we'll use this service. We'll copy the service name and we'll use oc edit route command, and we'll give the route name pet clinic application. This is the runtime YAML which has been provided. In this YAML, we will change the service name and we will save it. Now let's check the application in the browser. As you can see, the route has been created. Now we are successfully accessing the recently deployed application from the command line. Okay, now we have seen how to deploy application directly from source code onto OpenShift cluster. These activity involves to perform the build configurations. Assume if you want to deploy the same application onto production environment, then these build configs become irrelevant because we do not perform build activity on production server. Instead, we need deploy, service, and routes component. Now we will see how to club these components together as a template and deploy it on OpenShift cluster. So when we done the source to image deployment, a label gets attached to all the components. So let's list the components which we want to club together as a template using label. OC, get, deploy, SVC, route using label -L, app, OpenShift get. So these are the components that we need to export as a template. So for that we will use OC export, deploy, SVC, route, as it has a label app open shift -get. We are exporting as a template, so we'll give as template name. It is my pet clinic. We will output it as YAML, and we will route this output to YAML file, that is pet app.yaml. So now let's view the pet app.yaml. So this is the YAML file which has been created. It has deployment, it has service object, it has route object. So we need exactly all these objects clubbed together to be deployed on OpenShift cluster. These templates also supports the parameters. So let's add parameters to these template. For that we will use parameter tags. Parameter needs to be added with its name and its value. As of now, I'll keep this value as a blank, and I'll pass this parameter variable app wherever I want to use it. I'm using it for application and the name of that object. Okay, we have changed the template file with parameters. Now let's save it. Now let's create the parameter file, parameter.yaml. I will add app colon app name, that is pet clinic application. Now let's save this. Okay, so now everything is ready to be deployed. We will use OC process command to process the template with parameters and produce an output which can be passed to a create command to create the objects. So let's use OC process -f. We have a pet -app dot YAML. We will add param file equals to parameters dot YAML. We'll pipe this output to OC create -f dash command. Now the command has created deployment, service and routes. Let's see on the topology tab. So if you open topology tab, you will have one more application which has been deployed. Let's check the deployment. Pet clinic application. So now the pod is successfully running. So now let's browse this application using the route which has been created. Now the application has been deployed using template. So that's it for this demo.